Welcome back, guys. Hope you guys have learned how to differentiate the reading sections between TOEFL and IELTS. Today, I'm going to talk about the next section, listening. Well, actually, in TOEFL, the listening part is the second section, but in IELTS, it is the first section. Now, the difference is kind of huge. So, in the TOEFL, you are going to listen to two different types of listening. The first type is conversations between a student and a teacher or a staff from the school. And the next section is lecture. A lecturer, a professor, is going to talk about something that is as boring as the reading sections. The topics, again, spans from astronomy, archaeology, 17th century European trade, history of the Roman Empire, that kind of boring stuff. But different from the reading sections, in the listening, TOEFL is going to incorporate more interesting topics, well, interesting for nerds, such as the history of movies, the history of cinema, that kind of things. And here you are going to encounter something that might not be familiar to you, such as a play. The students might want to put on a play, or the teacher might be explaining the history of plays on stage, which actually is my forte, Shakespeare and stuff. But again, because TOEFL topics are quite repetitive, so with enough practice, you can get used to it. However, there is the rub. In TOEFL listening, you are going to listen to the recording of the conversation on the lecture first, before you can see the questions. Now, the questions here are all about multiple choices again, and this can be particularly tricky because when you are listening and when the topic does not interest you, you might not be able to focus throughout the sections, no matter how good your English is. I myself, whenever I took a TOEFL test, I felt like I couldn't even listen to, I couldn't even hear what they are saying, let alone taking notes. So note-taking in a TOEFL listening exam is what most of the teachers would recommend. But then again, it is kind of difficult for you guys to listen while writing. So a lot of students would complain that TOEFL listening is really hard because when you write notes, you cannot pay attention to the lecturer at the same time. But let me ask you this. You take the TOEFL test because you want to study in the United States. In the lectures, you are going to listen to the lecturer for like 2 hours and taking notes at the same time. If you can't even do that in a TOEFL test, how can you survive in the United States, in an American university classroom, so to speak? So guys, don't cheat. I know there are a lot of people who just hire other people to cheat on the test, but are you going to cheat throughout your entire life? Please be honest. If you cannot pass the test now, just give yourself some more time. Okay? So now, in the TOEFL, there's this simple strategy that I would use. Learning from reading, not only reading the TOEFL articles, but also, like I'm always promoting, reading the novels to give yourself a sense of a narrative structure of everything, of anything, which is actually human logic, so that even if you cannot hear some of the details, even if you miss some of the details, or like me, even if you fall asleep during the test, just use the different questions to help remind you what the lecture or the conversations is supposed to be about. Just take an educated guess. So that is TOEFL Listening. But in IELTS, oh my god, this is actually one of my favorite parts about the IELTS test, because in an IELTS test, you are allowed to read the questions first. It's like half a minute to 1 minute, I can't really remember. So you do have time to preview what you are going to hear. Therefore, when you are listening to a conversations or a lecture, then you will have a pretty good idea what you should be paying attention to. Now, but here's a tricky part. In the IELTS test, as in the reading sections, the listening is going to be more diverse, more closer to reality, closer to life than TOEFL. So, in first two sections in the IELTS listening test, you will hear conversations between perhaps a customer and a staff from customer service talking about a traveling itinerary, a plan to visit a festival, for instance. And in the second part, you might hear a person introducing you guys to a park. So you just walk around. Now, then again, like the reading sections, if you already are good at English, then these two parts are easy breezy. It's like a piece of little cake, a walk in a little park. And the next sections. Now, in the IELTS, there are 4 sections. In the first sections, you will hear 2 students discussing about a paper they are going to finish, a project that they have to complete. And in the 4 sections, just like TOEFL, you listen to a lecture on an academic subject. But then, since you can already see the questions, for those who are already good at English, IELTS listening should not be very difficult. Indeed, it should be a lot easier than TOEFL's listening. However, a last bit of advice for those who consider to take the IELTS test. Now, because in the IELTS test, you have both multiple choices and filling in the blanks. So your spelling becomes extremely important in the IELTS test. Don't worry about it, because the words they are going to test you on are quite simple, like environment, like pollution, like populations, like significance, like confusing, that kind of words. However, the plural forms, meaning the S at the end of the plural nouns, can be tricky, can be difficult to detect for beginners. So therefore, if you are a beginner and you want to tackle the IELTS test, I would still suggest that you start from reading, building up a very strong foundation. However, if you intend to take the TOEFL test, then again, remember, the general idea of these tests are to test your general ability of English. So as long as you can piece together the narrative structure of the entire passage, of the entire conversation or the lecture, then you'll be just fine. You'll be just fine. And final words on these two. The accents. In a TOEFL test, you are going to hear only the kind of like a neutral, standard American accents, which means it would sound either Californian or New York. But because these are tests, so they are going to tone down, water down the accent differences. So basically, in the TOEFL test, you have one accent to deal with. However, the IELTS is co-designed by the British and by the Australians. So at least you are going to hear both the British accents and the Australian accents quite often. And also, in the IELTS test, there is a huge chance you are going to hear the blessed, adorable American accents as well. And sometimes, if you are lucky, you are also going to hear the Indian accents, Italian accents, the Japanese accents, and so on and so forth. So, verdict. Which one is easier? Before I went to England, before I started my studies there, I was pretty unfamiliar with how English sounds. Seriously, I was only reading to myself, talking to my classmates and my teachers, and watching films. So apparently these experiences were not enough for me to place myself at the level of a native speaker. So listening was among the four most difficult for me. So both TOEFL and IELTS would have been very difficult for me. However, if you are not afraid of diverse topics, if you really want to see the questions first, go for the IELTS. But then again, just like reading, if you read the questions first, you might step into the trap of focusing too much on keywords again. So then again, perhaps TOEFL is still easier. Let me know what you think in the comment sections. And in my final lessons, I'm going to give you guys a kind of like a summary of these two tests, and my final verdict will be revealed in my final lessons. Next time, we are going to talk about my favorite part, writing. So stay tuned.